Good morning, colleagues, or good afternoon, colleagues. It's still morning here. I am delighted to be able to join you at this international conference and webinar. And I want to thank Professor Hemlata for her kind invitation, and also Dr. Seema and the technical team who have been helping me behind the scenes to make sure that we get everything right. I also want to thank Professor Dashora, who I listened in on his presentation at the end, talking about this importance of do unto others as you would have them do unto you, and the wise words of Gandhi and the cow and so on. So it is my absolute pleasure to be able to join you this morning, and I want to speak to you briefly about some aspects of my work around leadership and social justice and around racism in England in the teaching profession, as well as drawing on some other works from other studies in England and in Scotland and also in Jamaica. And I hope this will be beneficial to colleagues listening in across this conference. Next slide, please. So just a little context. There are a lot of Black, Asian, and minority ethnic students in England, and a lot of white students in England, as you can imagine. So anybody who is not white is considered Black, Asian, and minority ethnic. And there are approximately 9 million children in schools in England. And what we have seen is a lot of the students in England are from Black, Asian, minority ethnic origin. Here on the slides, we call them BAME, and some of the literature calls them BME, Black and minority ethnic. So if you hear me say BME or BAME, I'm talking about the same people. So what we know is that a number of students from Black, Asian, and minority ethnic backgrounds in England are from a minority background, a part of the school system. But we also realize that this is the group of students that is increasing the most in England over time. Perhaps due to migration or some other factor, but this, among the white students, they are not increasing as much as the Black, Asian, and minority ethnic students in England. Next slide, please. So in terms of the teachers in England, this is a different picture. There are approximately 452,000 teachers in England. And as you can see, approximately 86% of those are white. If you think back to this previous slide where we saw so many non-white students or BME students, you will see that when you look at the teachers, this is not the same picture. So the picture basically is there are far fewer Black, Asian, and minority ethnic teachers in England than white teachers, and there are far fewer Black, Asian, and minority ethnic teachers in England compared to students. So we see, for example, that there are 24,281 head teachers in England. But of the numbers of head teachers in England, we see that we have just over 270 of them who are Black or Black, Asian, and minority ethnic. So we realize essentially that the education system in England is white. It's a racist system where we have many black kids in the school, or black, Asian, and minority ethnic kids in the school, but we have very few teachers, and even very few teachers who are not white getting to the post of headmaster or head teacher or principal. Next slide, please. So higher education, the picture is the same. The picture is more or less the same. There are nearly 2 million students in the UK. And of this number, a lot of them, their ethnicity is not known, which is not good for the data. But what we know is that of those whose ethnicity are known, there are approximately 380,000 of them are from Black and Asian and minority ethnic background. So the picture is about 1/5 of the student population in universities are from non-white backgrounds. But when you look at the number of academics in the university sector in the UK, you see that 192,000 academic staff in the UK, and only 6.7%, or just under 13,000, are from BME heritage. So if you notice, 377,000 students are from non-white backgrounds, but only 12,864 academics are from non-white backgrounds, which, in other words, for approximately 1 Black, Asian, minority ethnic staff, you have 36 Black, Asian, minority ethnic students. So the ratio is 36:1. When we look at the numbers a little bit more, you see that there are about 12,000 professors who are white, about 4,700 professors are female, and we notice that in the UK at the moment there are just over 95 Black professors, and I am one of them. So we are saying then that we have a system where we have nearly 2 million students, and we have 377,000 non-white students in the system, but we only have about 95 Black professors in the system, or who are not white, which is 21st century Britain, really. So that was supposed to give you some kind of context, which I hope is helpful. And then we see the work of my colleague Vinnie Landa at the University of Leeds Beckett. And she did a study looking at how white teachers were prepared for dealing with racism in their teacher training. And she asked some questions, which I share here. How is race equality addressed, if at all, on ITE or initial teacher education programs in white institutions? And how do white student teachers reflect on their whiteness as part of their preparation? So these questions are important questions. What are their professional views and their personal views about race equality? Because if you look back at the previous slide, we have so many white teachers, 453,000 teachers in the UK, and we have, not that one, the one before, and we have a situation where over 399,000 of those teachers are white. So if white teachers are not sufficiently prepared to deal with non-white students, then this is a huge problem. So this is what Vinnie Landa was trying to understand. How do white teachers feel they are prepared to deal with racism in the classroom? The question there was interesting as well, because she was asking about their personal views, not only their professional views, because if they are racist, then they will not deal with racism when it happens within their classroom or within the school compound. Next slide, please. So what Winnie Lander found, and this is from some of the students that she interviewed. These are quotes from students that she interviewed in the study. She said, Stuart says, we are told to be aware of gender issues and race issues, but you weren't told necessarily what they were or what to do when these come up. No specific, no sort of training. So in other words, watch out for racism, watch out for gender discrimination, but they were not told what issues specifically to look out for, or they were not told what it means to be discriminated against for race, or what it means to be discriminated against for gender. And more importantly, they were not given the tools to deal with these if these situations came up. Stella, another student, said, I would not know how to handle it, to be fair. So she didn't feel that she was well prepared for this. And then Stuart, again, he said, there have been a few instances in school which I thought I would have been prepared for, but they took me by surprise. Some of the language that the students use and the non-teaching staff I found shocking. I wasn't sure how to actually deal with it, especially the staff, because is it something you don't expect? And it took me back. So these teacher trainees were going into schools, going into classrooms, and have no preparation to deal with racism in the classroom or racism in the schoolroom. This was hugely, hugely problematic. Next slide, please. And bearing in mind that these people are the ones who are going to be teachers. So Winnie Lander, she concluded that it was important that students, teachers, student teachers, trainee teachers, that they were educated properly about race and racism, but also that they were given the skills to be able to support non-white students as much as they are able to support white students, especially those non-white students whose first language was not English. And those BME students and those students whose first language was not English, they should not be treated like they're a problem to be solved, but they should be respected. No matter who you are, where you come from, they should be given respect just like anybody else. Next slide, please. The other study that I want to mention is one that was done by Arshad, looking at the teacher trainers. So Winnie Lander's study looked at the trainee teachers. This study looked at the teacher educators and whether they felt they could deal with racism in the system. So Arshad, Rowena Arshad, at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, she did this study and she asked those questions. How do teacher educators understand themselves and their role in relation to race and in respect of race in England and in Scotland? How do they see race? And in what ways do they address race inequality in their teacher education practice? Because if you're preparing the teachers, then you're preparing teachers to come out into the world where racism is, and therefore you should be equipping them to be able to deal with racism. Next slide, please. So Arshad, she presented her findings into two different categories. She looked at the findings for Scotland and she looked at the findings for England separately. For Scotland, she found that sexual orientation and race were the least talked about issues among teacher educators. So nobody wanted to talk about racism and sexual orientation. She also found that the teacher educators, their awareness of the various equity issues was, in a sense, sporadic. Some people learned about these issues based on their personal experience. Some persons learned about these experiences because they lived in diverse places, you know. So you live in a community where many Black people are, or many Indian people are, or many Chinese people are, or many non-white people are. So you understand a little bit about them and their circumstances. Or some people, it was they had some kind of reading, some theoretical or ideological views about them. So they read up about the issues. But, you know, people had different ways of understanding, but there was no consistent way of understanding the experience of those non-white people. Next slide, please. And in terms of race, what was interesting was that where you lived, Ashad found that where you lived influenced your opinion and your practice around race or racism or anti-racism. So people felt like, you know, if you live in a white part of the country, then there is no diversity. There's no race diversity. And therefore, you can't turn to the students to help you to teach, to learn. You can't turn to the community to help you to learn because everybody is white. But if you lived in more racially diverse communities or more ethnically diverse communities, then this would be helpful. So, you know, there was also problems because you didn't have a lot of BAME, Black, Asian, and minority ethnic people in high positions. It's the same thing. How do we want women to aspire to become chief executives and so on when we don't have women in these top positions? Similarly, how do we want Black people, Asian people, minority ethnic people, non-white people to aspire to becoming chief executives and other top roles when in fact they are not given the opportunities to have these roles? So what they found was that there was a lot of homogeneity of the staff and the students. In other words, they found that there was a lot of white students and a lot of white staff, and therefore the staff could not help the students to understand racism, and the students could not help the staff to understand racism because they are white, and therefore they do not understand and they do not experience racism either. Next slide, please. In terms of the findings for England, what Arshad found was a similar picture. But she found that there were few BME lecturers in universities, which I presented on the slide previously, a couple of slides previously, about the numbers, and there were a few BME students. So there was a problem then with the pipeline. The pipeline was either clogged or the pipeline was broken. So we cannot have racial justice if we don't have BME students who are training to be teachers. We cannot have BME chief executives if we do not have BME students doing well in schools. And we cannot have a new educational culture if we do not have BME students who are principals and head teachers and headmasters and headmistresses and so on. So there was representation was a problem. So there was not enough of the Black people or the Asian people or the non-white people who were getting those opportunities. Additionally, you know, they said teacher educators lacked confidence to talk about race, and they lacked the tools to challenge racism. Again, you cannot ask somebody who has not understood racism to try and fix racism. You cannot ask somebody who hasn't experienced it unless they understand it to fix it. So it's really important that we understand that they lack the confidence either because they have never experienced it or because they don't understand it, or both. Again, it's the same thing. How could you ask men to take on some issues for women and to lobby for women and to be advocates for women if they don't understand the deprivation and the violence that women face, or if they don't experience it themselves? And they won't experience it because they're men, so they need to understand it. And if they understand it, then they can help to change. But if they don't understand it, then women will always be treated badly by men and by society. It's the same point I'm making here, that if white people don't understand how racism affects BME people or non-white people, then racism will always be a part of society. Next slide, please. So this is what some of the teacher educators were saying from Arshad's study, that I need a lot of training. She said, I feel I need an awful lot of training. And for sure, most people would feel the same way. I am aware that the terminology is changing, and sometimes you have to speak politically correct. And I don't want to speak politically incorrect. I want to get it right. So I need training. But then said, what I have found, another person, what I have found when I have talked with other staff who are from non-minority backgrounds, in other words, when I talk to white staff about race, is that everybody is on the defensive. People are on the defensive because they think you are suggesting that they are not working sensitively with students, or that they are not aware of the issues, or they are racist. So people get very defensive. White people get very defensive to talk about race and racism. You can skip that slide and go to the next one, please. So people were saying they didn't have the confidence to talk about race and so on. So this is, again, I find that some students generally, they don't like to talk about race and they don't like to talk about class, social class. Those are the two things that they avoid talking about if possible. And when we get their essays back at the end of the year and they're allowed to choose topic for what they do, they're allowed to choose 2 or 3 to talk about in their essay. These are the 2 topics they generally avoid. Race, definitely. But class, some people will talk about it, but nobody want to talk about race. So race then is the zombie in the room, but nobody acknowledging that race is a zombie in the room. Next slide, please. And then the final study I want to share with you is one of my own studies with my colleagues and we looked at some work in Jamaica and in England. It's a comparative study. So the main questions we ask, because this is important for your conference, the main question we ask is, how do different education professionals do social justice work? And a lot of people consider themselves to be social justice advocates, social justice leaders. But we wanted to understand these 4 things. 1, how do you, what does it mean to you when you hear the word social justice? How do you do social justice work? What does it look like? What impact does your work have if you call yourself a social justice practitioner or a social justice leader? And how do you know this? But more importantly, even though you're doing social justice work, how can you do better social justice work? So this is a question that my colleagues and I have asked. Next slide, please. So the first theme was, what does social justice mean to you? Understanding social justice. And for this study, we interviewed people in Jamaica, people who are university lecturers, people who are principals, teachers. In England, they were principals, teachers again, and people on the school board and university lecturers. So it was education professionals. So it was anybody who was working in education at any level. It didn't matter. What we wanted to understand was their understanding of social justice and their doing of social justice. So this is what one lecturer in Jamaica said. She said, if you could go back, please. Said, social justice means respecting the rights of individuals. It means demonstrating equity and distributing resources, privileges, and opportunities a member of society or community in the setting within which I operate, in this case, the school. It is about fighting for the rights and reasonable interests of my students, my colleagues, and myself. So a key principle there in this definition of social justice is equity. Another person said, social justice means equity and fair treatment. So from what we are seeing here from these two definitions, a lecturer in England and a lecturer in Jamaica, that equity, the principle of equity and fairness, is crucial to their understanding of social justice. So what does social justice mean? And they are saying for them, social justice means equity and fair treatment. Next slide, please. And how do you do social justice? Because people say, I'm a social justice leader. I'm a social justice teacher. I'm a social justice vice chancellor. I'm a social justice pastor. I'm a social justice advocate. But what does that mean? How do you do it? So these people said, well, I use the university's policies and rules. In other words, I look for how the rules can be applied to the benefit of my students. I don't look for how the rules only prevent opportunities, but how the rules can create possibilities. One of Jamaica's former prime minister, the most honorable P.J. Patterson, a couple of years ago, he said, the law is not a shackle, but a force for social engineering. And this is the point that this lady was making here. She was saying that the rules of the university are not a shackle, but they are there to develop, to liberate my students and my staff. Of course, the rules can be a shackle, but she did not see them as a shackle. She saw them as a source, as a tool for social engineering. So wherever possible, she would use the rules. She would exploit the rules, change the rules, go around the rules, go within the rules. But she was making sure she was staying out of trouble, but using the rules to liberate her students rather than being imprisoned by the rules. And then, go back. And you could see those positive, those verbs. Look at those verbs. I use, I ensure, I consider, I lobby, I advise, I raise. All of those are active verbs. Those are action points. So we cannot say that we are a social justice leader without demonstrating what we do. And this is where people are saying, I do this, I use the policies, I ensure, I consider, I lobby for, I advise, I raise concerns. In other words, all of these things demonstrate not only an understanding of social justice, but an activism around social justice. Next slide, please. The next theme Or the next question was the impact of social justice work. Many of us can claim that we are social justice leaders, we are social justice teachers, we are social justice, as I said, vice chancellors or whatever, you name it. But how do we know what impact our work is having? How do you know? How do you know that you are creating change? And what does that look like? This is what this principal in Jamaica said. She said, my staff and my students have taught me lessons about my role as a leader. And as a result, I have been forced to become more reflective before and after my encounters with them to ensure I have not been unfair in any way. Again, the whole issue of fairness comes up. But more importantly, we see that in being a social justice leader, her staff and her students are becoming more social justice oriented, and therefore they are teaching her about what social justice practice looks like. Next slide, please. A university lecturer on the same point said, my practice impacts my students as I demonstrate equity in distributing resources and privileges, and I fight for them. I insist that I'm not getting involved in unfair practice. I insist that it should be fair for all students, and so on and so forth. So we see here that one teacher is saying, if one child wants a remark of a test for whatever reason, many colleagues would say, well, let's give that child one mark because, you know, it's a nice boy or a nice girl. But what she's saying is, well, if you give that one person that 1 point, are you advantaging the one person and disadvantaging the others? And what she's saying, in the face of that dilemma, she would give everybody. So her stance is really, really critical, because it is saying that, you know, we cannot advantage some and not advantage all, and we cannot disadvantage some and not disadvantage all. So it's really a paradox, but she's saying she's creating opportunities for all her students. Next slide, please. And the final category we talked about was, how do you widen and deepen this work? How do you widen and deepen social justice work? And she said, I will seek to more effectively model emotional intelligence. This is critical. A lot of us as leaders, we claim to be emotionally intelligent, but we are not. And this is one principle saying, I will seek to be more emotionally intelligent towards all levels of my staff. I will ensure that appropriate programs are in place from the guidance department to help staff and students. This is about mental health and well-being. I will also ensure that at all levels of staff are provided with training and development workshop to build them up professionally and intellectually and emotionally. And did you notice she said all categories? So the canteen staff, the groundsmen, all categories of staff, not only teachers, the people who work in the office, the people who work in the kitchen, all categories of staff. I will model social justice practices that teacher can emulate. I will ensure that there is appropriate parenting workshops provided to parents to build their self-esteem, which in turn will help to build the self-esteem of their children. So there's a multiplier effect here. And this is a principle reflecting on her practice, that social justice is not only for her, but it's for everybody. You could go on to the next one. And this was a university lecturer saying, I will continue to speak out against racism in England. But to stand a chance of having an impact, I will have to work much more collaboratively with other colleagues. In other words, to tackle the problems of social justice, whether it's racism, classism, gender discrimination, the discrimination of speakers of other language or so on, you cannot do it alone. You might have all the fire in your belly, but you cannot do it alone. You need other people to take with you, to help you in this fight. Next slide, please. And then there are a couple examples, couple other examples that came out of the study, but you can skip over this. So we produced this model from our study, and this model is really important. So, we created this model from our work that we argue that the work of educationalists like you, like me, like so many other people, is hinged on 3 levels. You have the pedagogic activism, and the pedagogic activism is about the content of your lessons, but it's also your teaching style. What content do we give students, and how do we give them that content? Is that content fit for purpose? Is that content enabling? Is that content empowering? Then we developed this notion of the regulatory activism. We saw from the study, it is that study we used to develop this model. We saw the teachers, the lecturer saying, I will use the rules, the regulations, for the advantage of all my students. So we know that regulations sometimes are in the institutions. Well, all institutions have regulations, but some of those regulations sometimes disempower people. They disempower staff, they disempower students, or they disempower certain groups of staff or certain groups of students. So we believe that as a leader, as a teacher, as a manager, as an educationalist, you, me, all of us together, we have got a responsibility that where the regulations do not work, we replace them, we revise them, that we build new regulations in their places, or we amend them. But we have to engage in regulatory activism because it is the regulations that sometimes do harm to the people who we're trying to liberate. Sometimes the staff, sometimes the students. And then the final one is the emancipatory activism. If you ask me, colleagues, to define social justice, in the simplest term, I would say it's about fairness. And this sense of emancipatory activism is that fire in your belly. It is that fire in your belly which makes you want to fight for women's rights when you're a man. It is that fire in your belly that makes you want to fight for the speakers of other languages when your language is English. It is that fire in your belly that makes you want to fight for Black people when you're white. It is that fire in your belly that makes you want to fight for working class people when you're rich. It is that fire in your belly that makes you want to fight for wrongs in society, for disabled learners, for learners of all kinds, of all shades, as long as they need someone to fight for them. That, my friend, that emancipatory activism is the core of who you are. It is hinged on your values and your beliefs. It cannot be regulated. No law can regulate that, nor can any law unregulate it. It is the core of who you are, your values, what you stand upon. And so we argue here that your emancipatory activism will make you a more creative teacher, a more creative leader. Your emancipatory activism will make you challenge the regulations, will make you build new regulations, will make you put new regulations in place, will make you do all kinds of things because you realize that the fire in your belly wants you to solve these bigger problems. Now, you might not be able to solve all of them, but if you put the fire in your belly out, then your pedagogic activism will die and your regulatory activism will also die. Next slide, please. So, colleagues, the final slide for this presentation is a definition of social justice from my work and from Tillman and Dantley's work. Now, social justice leadership has 7 characteristics. 7. Again, we are talking about global justice and global peace for the conference. And it's important then for us to look at how we are in creating this global justice and global peace. Social justice leaders, 1, they actively try to right the wrongs of marginalized groups. Whatever those marginalized groups are, women, children, the disabled, the minority, the people who are poor, the sick, the dispossessed. But social justice leaders actively try to right wrongs for marginalized groups. 2, they use their position to create safe spaces. All of us, professors, leaders, vice chancellors, teachers, we are powerful people. We are very powerful people. We have different levels of power based on the positions we are in. But let's face it, we are very powerful people. And we have to use that power that comes with our position to right wrongs or to create safer spaces for all. If we don't use the power that comes with our position, then what are we here for? What exactly is our purpose on earth? So social justice leaders use their position to create safe spaces and opportunities. Thus, accordingly, social justice leaders are activists in both intent and approach. And that is really crucial. They are activists. You cannot be a social justice leader. That is why the paper is called Social Justice Leadership as Activism. 3, they understand the material, economic, and social differences between groups. You have to understand your people. If you're a head teacher, you understand that all the children in your class and in your school are not the same. Some of them are rich, some of them are poor, and some of them are in between, and they have different needs. Same thing for the vice chancellor. You understand some of them are rich, some of them are poor, some of them live near to universities, some live far, and they have different needs. Some of them are mature, some of them are part-time students, some of them are young. We understand their material and social and cultural and all of the factors impacting them. And when we do understand these things, we can better support them. We social justice leaders, they focus on creating equity for all. Social justice leaders also, they move beyond equality debates to equity debates, because equality is about giving everybody the same thing, and equity is about giving everybody what they need, what they need in their particular situation or circumstances, right? So you don't just simply give everybody in the class £10, because then the rich will have 10 more pounds. And the poor will only still have £10. But you give the rich £1 and give the poor 10, so that the rich will have 11 and the poor will now have 11. You know, so equity is about giving people the resources and the support they need at their particular circumstance. And then finally, social justice leaders are activist leaders. It comes up again in both the definitions. Activist leaders who work to create fairness in schools for all who study and work in them. Not only the teachers, not only the students, not only, but the dinner lady, the security or the watchman, the teaching assistants, everybody in a school, everybody matters equally. Every human being matters equally. Whether you're rich, you're poor, whether you're female, male, whether you speak English or not, whether you are disabled or not, it does not matter. The social justice leader works to create fairness for all who study and work in their schools. Most importantly here, colleague, they interpret their role as working towards the empowerment for all. There's no greater purpose on earth than working towards the liberation of each other. Thank you, colleagues.